Hello and welcome back to Second Breakfast. I'm Cam and we're going to be doing something a little different this week. Maggie is indisposed, so I'm going to be covering something that she doesn't care about or something that she hasn't read/watched. So this week we are going to be looking at the British House of Cards trilogy, and I'm going to be very much spoiling this 90s TV show for you. But that's okay, because you weren't going to watch it anyway, and you probably stopped watching the US remake at some point. But there's a lot to play with here, and it builds off a lot of the things we've talked about in our Lord of the Rings discussions, as well as some of the stuff from our horror movie talks. And I'm framing this specifically as the House of Cards trilogy. Even though each part is almost its own standalone miniseries, they're not called like House of Cards Season 1, 2, and 3. It's House of Cards. Then the second series, to use the UK parlance, is called To Play the King. And then the third one is called The Final Cut. And together they form this House of Cards trilogy. And I think, obviously, talking about Lord of the Rings for hundreds of hours here, I think trilogies are a fascinating structure for a series because, especially here where you have each individual chapter, it's 4 episodes per series here, you have this like Russian nesting doll of structures where each part of the overall story, there's the beginning, the middle, the end, the rising action, the conclusion, the like fun Ocean's 11-y kind of introduction to the characters at the beginning. It's fun. The conceit of the show, if it's called House of Cards, is that everything's going to fall apart. It's this idea of a comeuppance, and the first season very much feels like we're ratcheting to the top of a roller coaster, and things only go off the rails. We only start to descend at the end of the first season. Which is weird, because it could have gone that nothing bad happens. He gets away with it, to use the like Breaking Bad angle. He gets away with it till maybe the end of the third series. And then finally there's this comeuppance. Because you can't really have a comeuppance at the end of each part of a trilogy, or it becomes just kind of this finger-waggling, moralizing to the camera. But at the same time, if 3/4 of your show is just a horrible person getting away with it, does that get boring? That's the reason I was interested in watching this, because I knew that there was a book. I'd never read it. I was intimidated, I think, by the UK government being the backdrop for it, because I don't understand the machinations of that as well as I do the one here. But I don't know. The show was on Amazon Prime. It was on Netflix for a long time because of the remake, but then it left and I stopped thinking about it. It was on Amazon Prime, so I started the first one, and it was such tight, great storytelling, but I was so dumb. Like, it didn't matter that the backdrop was different than what I'm used to politically. But each series here, and they are of varying quality, they do each have an element of that comeuppance or downfall, and then it starts up fresh again when we get to the next season. Very much this starts to feel, I know it's obviously informed by Shakespeare, the TV adaptations always have people talking to the camera, there's that aside or soliloquy angle, but there's a lot to read in here from like Shakespeare's histories, in that each miniseries, it's given its own name, it's separated by a few years, it's not like, US TV where it's usually, 10 months before it comes back. Here it's like 3 years and then 2 years, and it really feels like 3 eras of a character's life, to the point that there are cliffhangers at the end of Season 2 that are just ignored, and Season 3 picks up a long time later and none of it's relevant anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's jump back. I'm going to spoil this, obviously, and I'm just going to give you the broad strokes of what you need to understand what I'm talking about. You don't need to have seen the show or even be familiar with it. It's basically about a political animal trying to get to the top of the food chain. And the first season is very much, this character's name is Francis Urquhart. And he's ratcheting to the top of the roller coaster. He's developing a relationship with a journalist named Maddie Storin, and he's working to unseat the current prime minister after he's basically denied the job that he was promised if he got this guy into the top office. And the season ends with political success, right? He unseats that prime minister, and Maddie, the woman he's having an affair with, she betrays him. She starts recording him in their like private moments, and he's confessed to killing this lower tier pawn politician that he kind of had under his wing. she asks him point blank towards the end when she's getting kind of skittish if he killed the guy, and he says yes, and he's like trying to trust her, I guess, and she's recording him. So he finds out and he kills her and throws her over the side of a building. It's strange because this happens in the US version, but it's, I don't know, it's less Shakespearean, I guess. The Maddie character is thrown in front of a train eventually. And there's something about being thrown off a building. Like, if we hadn't just had the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock thing, maybe I wouldn't be thinking about it in that context. But it's so over the top and impractical. Like, there's that lower tier pawn politician that Francis kills at one point. He kills him with rat poison. He slips rat poison into his cocaine while the guy is passed out drunk. And that is so goofy and over the top and villainous that it's fun. But seeing an old man like WWE this woman over the side of a building is a little strange. Like, it's fun, but it almost can't reach the dramatic heights that you want for that moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The fascinating part to me of this series was this merciless division between seasons. When he kills Maddie at the end of season 1, it feels like the end of the story. And I'm sure there are people who just stopped watching after the first series, in the same way the book was originally a one-off and it was later kind of retconned so the author could continue writing the books and picking up all those royalties as the adaptation exploded. There are very, very few characters. Obviously, the main sort of romantic counterpart's murdered at the end of the first series, but even of the supporting cast, there are very few people who cross over into the second season. And Francis basically kills a bunch of his friends and allies and girlfriends at the end of the second series, too. So there are very few crossover characters into the third season. And I didn't like that initially because it felt too disjointed. It felt like we were trying to start over with this premise again because you need him to be somehow aggrieved. You need him to have an enemy, but also at the end of the season, he has to be victorious and elevated to a higher position. And that kind of power creep or arms race, eventually it becomes untenable for a show. But there's so much Shakespeare in here. There are just, Francis will interrupt people and start quoting. He'll start quoting Shakespeare at them. It starts to feel like Shakespeare's histories in that the eras of some of the kings that Shakespeare writes about. I'm mostly here going to talk about Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and then Henry V. There's a huge change in station for the main characters between Henry IV parts 1 and 2. There's a big political rebellion at the end of part 1, and part 2 is extremely slow and philosophical. Not slow in a bad way, but it is a reflection on the sprinting drama of part 1. And by the time you get to Henry V, as the guy leading the revolution and then elevating in the political ranks, as he is coronated and becomes the king in Henry V, there are one or two characters who follow him. But again, they're in such different phases of their life that it feels like distinct eras. It doesn't feel like seasons of a show like we would sort of talk about. And in this way, season 2 works as a redux, almost an echo of the paranoid Francis Urquhart that we know from season 1 here. He develops a new relationship with a new young woman. Like, there's this element of cyclical repetition here as we go into season 2. But this time, instead of being a journalist who's purely useful because he's a politician so he can use a journalist to leak stories, she's very much a utility, Maddie is, before they develop a romantic relationship, which is all screwed up and lopsided in the first season. But here, the woman is named Sarah, and she's a political consultant who he gets very, very close to. He constantly talks about loving her brain, needing her brain. They have... I don't think their relationship is as close emotionally, but because they have much more similar skill sets and worldviews, I felt invested in her as a character, not just concerned for her as a victim of what Francis was going to do. But throughout season 2, there are flashbacks to Maddie and the moment of him throwing her over the side of the building. It's fascinating because it's almost boring like you see this moment and it's edited where it doesn't have that kind of goofball old man WWE thing that it does the first time you see it. It's edited where you see the shot from underneath as she's falling. So it's much more dramatic, it's much more serious. But you see this shot so many times that I think as a viewer I became numb to it, where I remembered her and they always layer over the scream of, she calls him daddy, it's a whole thing. Watch the show. That part of it's really fun, the weird Freudian manipulation stuff. But her screaming and falling, the audience grows used to it. Yes, it's a huge, shocking thing, but when you see it so many times, there's a numbness. So what you start to pay attention to is how hard it hits Francis every time he remembers it. Because you would think it would be the guilt of murdering someone. It's implied that he's done these, like, freaky, brutal, backroom political dealings and betrayals and setups before to get to this point in his life. But him actually throwing a woman over the side of a building is presented as an escalation in his bad behavior. But it's not guilt that he seems to be expressing, or that Ian Richardson, the actor who plays Francis, I'm saying Francis a lot because his last name's weird, It's guilt occasionally that he's expressing when we see these flashbacks, but mostly he earnestly seems to be missing her, which is all sorts of screwed up, of course, because he killed her and manipulated her the whole time she was alive. But in her death, there's this growing feeling that he had this warped, true love for her and is somehow feeling this loss that he directly caused. It has that Henry IV Part 2 kind of reflection on what he's done to Maddie. But I don't know. I really liked Sarah as a character, but the show had very little interest in her. Like, so much of the time that we could have used to develop how Sarah was an evolution of Maddie was used to mourn Maddie instead. And by having this increasingly impossibly old politician have all of these new girlfriends who are these young, beautiful professionals, it frames season 2 as like an escalation or repetition of season 1. And I'm not saying that I felt that season 2 was derivative. It was interesting, making the woman more of an equal instead of this weird, like, political utility that he developed a fondness for. And on the political side of things, they replace this fight for who gets to be prime minister. At the end of season 1, Francis becomes prime minister once he unseats that other guy. So his enemy here in season 2, the person he's warring with throughout this series, is the new King of England, which is, like, they slightly ignore the actual royal family, which is probably a more tasteful way to do this. But they have a new king being coronated at the beginning of season 2, and it's just absurd and earnest enough to work. It elevates Francis's. Every description of this show calls it this delicious, indulgent, mustache-twirling, weird drama, and I like that because he's grotesque. He's evil, but he's enjoying every moment of it. And as an audience, I love that too. I love the beginning of heist movies before everything falls apart. There's something just fun in watching bad behavior, and it makes this series, as we get more into the politics, like what are the powers of a prime minister versus a king? The king is increasingly trying to get political instead of just sitting in that figurehead role. It makes the show satirical because Francis has to be this, like, arch conservative pulling back the reins on everything, fiscally and socially, while the king does these, like, weird progressive TV ads for how we should be nicer to people. Like, you make the gulf between these two political perspectives so wide that it becomes kind of goofy and loses some of that fun evil of the first series. And I don't know, it kind of spins off from me. It kind of loses the energy from that first series. But there's this moment at the end of season 1 that may have kind of just screwed me up for how I could earnestly interpret season 2. Because after Maddie is killed, there's a fourth wall moment So much of the show is Francis talking to the audience, and I love that too. And I think that's part of that confessional mustache twirling. We're all in on this bad thing, but it's safe because our perspective is so tied to this guy who's in every scene and he's the lead. There's this moment after he kills Maddie where he acknowledges the audience and he starts talking right to us because there's no one left in the scene now, and he's acknowledging our discomfort with what he's just done. It's the first moment that these asides stop feeling like the character's innermost thoughts, which is the way these things are presented in Shakespeare. That's what I'm used to. That's the way it's presented in Fleabag and all these other like fun fourth wall breaking things. I love that. I don't know. I'm a sucker for it. But there's a strange moment after he kills Maddie where he turns to us and he says these kinds of things happen all the time. Politicians just murdering people and arranging for people to be killed. And like, it's the most jaded, dark worldview of politics and geopolitics you could possibly imagine, but it's presented as boring fact. Like, he's scolding us for being upset about it or shocked by it. And he instantly starts to retcon his whole relationship with Maddie. He starts to redefine it like, oh, she was a journalist, I think. I knew her a little bit. She interviewed me once. But it's not even as goofy as the way I just summarized it. It's him like sitting there talking to us in total control, which is sort of the position we're used to him being in the show. But in this moment, Francis is so cold. He's so static that we're watching his eyes glaze over. It's almost this autopilot where he can completely reframe this relationship and cut himself out of the story. Obviously, he's not taking responsibility, but it's like he had this ready to go. This whole, it's like an anti-obituary where he can divorce himself from this reality and what happened. It's such a stunning performance that he gives, even when the writing suffers, even when the framing of the story is kind of weird. In this moment, we're watching him like calcify before our eyes. It's really cold and upsetting, but as a guy who was a founding member of the Royal Shakespeare Company and his ashes, I looked this up, his ashes were buried underneath the theater in Stratford-upon-Avon. He elevates the material, especially in these moments where he actually kills people, because those are, when I think of Shakespeare, I think of the murder moments, because I think the dramas, that was the chair, not a fart. I think of the dramas as the height of Shakespeare, and I think of the murders as the height of Shakespeare's drama. So this is how I judge these things. There's a 3-year break before season 2 comes back. It's 1990 and then 1993, and then the last season is 1995. And in the 3 years between season 1 and season 2, Francis, or Ian Richardson, I guess, is visibly aged. He's an old man in season 2. His face has sagged a little. I'm not saying he gained weight. He's as sharp, if not sharper, as a performer. But it does change the way you perceive him, that the character looks older, looks softer, and now he's in this ostensibly more reserved position as the prime minister. And it's strange. It's like he went from flirting and plotting and being this active, spry, evil, kind of hungry member of the political establishment to, as we rejoin him years later and in a comfortable, higher position in life, he's slightly deflated. He doesn't have to work as hard. He's more comfortable, and that changes, I think, the way the audience can enjoy him, because he's calcified into one of these evil, twisted political gargoyles. There's more of a sense of autopilot. There are fewer people he has to manipulate. There are fewer rungs left for him to climb up the ladder. And as an effect of that, I think there's a lot less fourth wall breaking. So we feel less closely tied to him. We don't feel like we are, charging the beaches with him in this most important moment. There's a heavier emphasis on other characters. Francis recedes a bit in season 2 and way more in season 3. And I don't think coincidentally, there's way less fourth wall breaking in season 3 as well. So season 2 ends with a redux of everything we saw in the end of the first season. Instead of Maddie being thrown over a roof, we have Sarah and Francis's main, like, loyal lieutenant who has just betrayed him. He blows them both up with car bombs. He blames the IRA. He sets it up to make it look like a terrorist attack. And we don't see that Shakespeare moment. We don't see the moment with the dagger or the blood on the hands or any of those, like, fun drama moments that afterwards produce the best soliloquies, I think. It's always that moment after the brutal, unexpected murder where we get the most vulnerable character development. As a cross, or maybe as an offshoot of Francis being in this more reserved, comfortable position, after he orders these murders at the end of season 2, these car bombs, he just gets a phone call. He gets a call from one of his lackeys confirming that these hits are done. And it's not a musical crescendo moment like The Godfather when he hits 20 people at the same time. It's not like that. It's just a call saying, like, oh yeah, the burritos, I dropped them off at the front door. It barely feels like a murder. And it's not just that he is safer and more insulated. He's distanced. He's not a politician on the roof of Parliament throwing a journalist off the building. That's a much more precarious position for one to be in when the police are there. It's that he acts so dispassionately here. And over the course of the whole third series, so, 4 episodes, a ton of dialogue, these are slightly longer episodes, he never mentions Sarah again. The one that I thought he was more of an equal with, who he was in love with her brain, he never mentions her again. And as I was watching season 3, I was waiting for him to talk about this. I was waiting for him to mourn her and grieve her and feel this weird, stronger love feeling after she was already dead, like he did with Maddie. And there was none of that. And that felt like a failure in the writing for me when I was watching these episodes. But it's so intentional. It's such a swerve away from what you've just been doing that it must be intentional. It must be some sort of statement, I think, because he continues to relive the Maddie murder with that same flashback, with that same shot of her falling off the building, with that same scream throughout the entire last season. Until, and I think this must be the point that I just suggested that the writers, the creators are making here. I think Francis killing Maddie, throwing her over the side of that building, is his Macbeth killing Duncan moment. I think it's his point of no return where he finally does the horrible thing. Instead of just the mustache-twirling, plotting behind the scenes, manipulating other people to do bad things and ruin their own careers and him passively elevating his own, it's him taking action, doing something reprehensible, and feeling the repercussions of that. I think that must be the point here, that he doesn't ever go back to these other 2 characters that he murders in the same way. There's no mention of either of them, his most loyal lieutenant or the woman he's ostensibly in love with, who he had this mind meld with. Neither of them are ever mentioned again. And I think it's just us seeing that this older, slower man, and I'm not being sympathetic towards him, I'm trying to understand the character. I think it's that part of him was broken when he was challenged in that moment, like the put up or shut up of, are you going to be this goofy Looney Tunes villain on the side, or are you going to throw a woman off a building? And he does that, and I think in the same way Macbeth is haunted through the rest of the play after he kills Duncan, I mean, it screws with Lady Macbeth too, with her dreaming that she's trying to wash the blood off her hands. I think the suggestion here is killing Maddie is that moment for Francis. And season 3, in the same way season 2 was a kind of a la carte reflection on some parts of season 1, season 3 becomes this echo or evolution reflection on that Maddie flashback that I talked about being so important. And we see it so much that I started to get bored when it would come on again because I know it and it's not effective for me anymore. It just is a scene. I don't know. It felt like they were filling time. I know they were doing more with it, but I just mean they sapped so much of the drama out of such an important moment that the repetition had to be like the takeaway was purely, like I said before, that this scene was still affecting Francis, even when I'm bored of it. which I guess makes sense because I've never thrown a woman off a roof. So the echo, or the a la carte thing that we're pulling from season 1 and using as the framework of season 3, instead of him reflecting and reliving the moment of killing Maddie, season 3 is led by this strange flashback of Francis when he was a young man in the army killing these two men. And we were introduced to the men's niece, who is eventually the one who, like, puts it together and tries to ruin Francis's career. That's as close as we get to, like, the payoff of this title here, House of Cards. But it never feels like when Francis has these flashbacks, most of them are conducted in dreams. Like, he wakes up from a bad dream after we see a shot of young Francis's hand with a gun. Luckily, they don't try to de-age him or anything. I guess they wouldn't have in the 90s, but even a different actor, like, this guy's so... He looks like an old Alan Rickman crossed with the Grinch from the animated movie. And I don't know if there's a young actor that can catch that. That would maybe like a young Willem Dafoe. I don't know. You have to be really funky looking. But as we see this like new recurring vision of young Francis killing these two guys, it never feels like his heart is in it. It doesn't feel like he's bothered on like a heart and mind level like he was with Maddie. It doesn't feel like this is something he legitimately feels uncomfortable about. It feels like he's reliving this moment because he's worried about the political repercussions of it. It's another sign that this guy is becoming a gargoyle, a dinosaur. He's less of an active player, and he's more being fussy about his legacy. He's not worried about how do I get into power. It's how are people going to write about me in 30 years after I'm dead. So the season 3 steers the show back from this farcical prime minister versus king, which it gets to an elevated level where it starts to feel sort of phony. Instead, season 3 becomes exceedingly practical. Francis's wife, who really didn't get much to do, she didn't really get her own plot in season 1 or 2, she finally gets something to do. The actress is incredible. The character's name is Elizabeth. She's working in the background throughout season 3 as Francis is kind of boringly obsessed with his legacy. Elizabeth takes over and she's planning for their retirement. Like, she's worrying about their actual day-to-day lives instead of zooming out and worrying about, like, the pages of history. So she talks to all these different foreign officials and people in these various industries trying to line up the dirty money and investments that will fund their long, happy, evil retirement. And Francis, in the meanwhile, he's, like, bartering and plotting a little. He's trying to put out fires, basically, that will boot him out of office, because you can be elected many more times as a prime minister than you can as a president here, just to fill in people who had the same blind spots I did going into this. He's vamping. Vamping is a term I learned from Pandora before we had Spotify and Apple Music as a type of music that, or it's a feature of music where you repeat verses or phrases or notes or sections of a song. I mean, I like metal songs that are like 25 minutes long, or I did at the time, and there's a lot of vamping in that. I like those sort of grooves, those jam session kind of things. And it feels like Francis is vamping. He's just keeping it going for long enough, and he says this as season 3 moves forward, that he just wants to be in office long enough to beat Margaret Thatcher's record so he can be the longest-serving prime minister. And it's strange because we do still get the occasional scene of him just talking to us, but mostly it's him talking to the people who work for him, who are not at liberty to be honest and be embarrassed for some of his goals. And it's strange. Like, we don't have the intimacy with him, which means we have less sympathy. We feel less invested in his thoughts and his mission. So we're just seeing these like blank faces across the desk from him. And his sense of autopilot, it's mildly compelling because the acting is still amazing, but the story seems to lose interest in Francis. It drifts more and more to these tertiary characters. I mean, there are 20 minutes at a time in the last season that are with all these other characters, and Every one of them is jockeying for position in the future administration. They are all lesser, dumber, slower political animals than we know Francis can be at his height, although he's certainly not there anymore. And whenever he does swoop in to resolve something or strong-arm some political kerfuffle, it's as a bully. He's working as a bully, and he's doing that like LBJ thing where he leans over people, but there's no planning anymore. There's none of that Ocean's 11, like everything is so absurdly intricate, and the mustache-twirling thing is gone. And I think as Francis loses interest in some of these things, so do I, and as an audience member. And by the time the third series ends and Elizabeth arranges Francis's assassination, it's like a way to frame him as a martyr and save the legacy that he's endangered. He ends up killing children in this international crisis, and he tries to strong-arm something, basically, and it doesn't work. It's that Richard III moment where he tries to use his strength and political acumen, but he's using it too late against the wrong person, and everyone just shrugs at it. Like you see his effectiveness end. You see that the tools don't work anymore. But by the time Elizabeth does this, she arranges his assassination at this like weird Thatchery coronation thing, right as he breaks this record. It doesn't even feel like a betrayal. I didn't care that most of his followers were moving to his successor. I didn't care that his successor was confirmed to be mildly dirty and not like the magnanimous, let's save Britain kind of person you'd want to take over after this evil, cancerous gargoyle who's there for 20 years. It was very much like Malcolm at the end of Macbeth, where it's like, this guy's not as bad as Macbeth, but he's still kind of bad, isn't he? I didn't feel shocked at that. There's some level of cynicism in the worldview of ending things like that, but I was struck by not feeling that Francis's wife, Elizabeth, was betraying him. It legitimately just felt like the pre-need you do with like a funeral home. Like she was just making her own arrangements, and the humanity of the show is gone by then. You could say it died with Maddie. You could say it died when Francis got power and, the dog didn't have anything left to chase. The humanity of the show is so calcified by that point that it just felt like vultures, just like snapping away and eating, I don't know, unidentified goo on the ground. There are plenty of shots and cuts where the commercial breaks would be in season 1. Constantly shots of rats on like government buildings or running along little monuments, and those make this point regularly about how like dirty and corrupt and awful this is as an industry and how uncouth everyone who's involved in it is. But by this dispassionate ending, the vultures shot, the amount I felt detached from this character and these set of characters, I guess the couple that roll on with him through seasons, I don't know, it was like the energy was gone. The glee that Francis brought to the first season was never matched again. I mean, the first season, like 3/4 of an episode, can be just him talking to the camera. And I don't mean him just turning to the camera after something's done or a conversation is in a lull or something he's done pays off and he'll like look over at us and kind of wink, or this little smirk will come on. It's not just that. There are legitimately just shots of the camera right in front of his face that it will layer over things or transition into that. Season 1 is as close to a character's mind as like I've ever seen. It's unbelievable. First season's incredible. Maybe don't do the other two. But when you develop that relationship with an audience, reflecting on meetings, framing meetings, introducing characters to us, interrupting your wife and other characters with Richard III quotes, using the campy like rat poison and in the weird little British outfits with the Sherlock Holmes kind of hat, you notice when that glee is gone. There is that like stark, brutal, historical reality that you fall into. And if season 2 feels like a mildly considered reflection on the first season, almost like you're standing in the mirror trying to notice how much you've aged, like the stakes are higher, we should feel more attached, but somehow you just don't. Like Francis is, like I've said, he's too content as prime minister. He has too many allies. He has too much power. It has that melancholy that Henry IV Part 2 had. And season 3 moves beyond that melancholy, almost to the point where it moves beyond Francis as a character. And the perspective becomes global. You're dealing with other prime ministers and other presidents. And in addition to losing that glee, that scrappiness is gone. There's nowhere else for him to go. There are no lands left to conquer. And this is where we reach the title of the show, this project. And the thing that I was most excited about in the US remake, because I grew up watching great adult dramas like West Wing and eventually Sopranos and things like that, and they all meant a lot to me. Like, TV drama gets me going like nothing else does. And the US House of Cards was really important to me because it felt like that first hard, rough-boiled, great, energetic drama with brutal twists and character deaths. It was the first one that I watched alone. So, and it was with a character talking right to the camera like I had never, ever seen before. It really changed my relationship with art as a whole, I guess. And the way that show ended, with having sort of the impromptu last season and you don't have all of the cast there anymore, it meant that you didn't get the payoff. The best part to me of every Shakespeare play is the ending. I don't think any work of art really has a better ending than Hamlet. The reason I was disappointed with the end of Game of Thrones is that it wasn't a blowout with one character left to say, oh shit, that was bad. There was no Horatio moment at the end of Game of Thrones. I like the downfall. And if the premise of your show, a House of Cards, I want to see it all fall apart. And there just isn't really that downfall here. It's strange. I'm not just saying it's a bad ending, because I think that's oversimplified. But let me talk about it a little. It's not about Maddie. It's not an investigation by fellow reporters that eventually ties him to Stamper's death, and that's the loyal lieutenant, and Sarah's death, and Maddie's death, and he's killed 3 different people, and he framed the Irish, and blah, 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 blah. The big downfall at the end of season 3 is a payoff about the political blackmail with the war flashback that they added in season 3. And those, faint echo murders that we heard about from his dreams and the shot of the young Francis's hand with the gun. It's that thing that we barely cared about. That's the thing that brings him down. There's very little conspiracy. It's not really even all the other politicians outsmarting him, which would be kind of disappointing in a different way. It's not the reporters rallying against him. So none of these professions that we've lauded and complicated through the series rise up. There's no fun political machination paying off and overwhelming this power player. And there's no moment of true shock or crumbling. There's no moment where they finally, crazy Macbeth gets stuck with the sword and we see him realizing that he's lost, that he's not prophesized to win every single battle. And then there's the shot afterwards of his head being dragged through the fight. There's none of that here. And I think, again, disturbingly, these are becoming my takeaways from watching this series, I think that was the point. That people in power in these high levels do horrible things, use and abuse people wantonly without a second thought, and then get their nest egg and recede from the stage. I've talked about as sort of these metaphors, rats, vultures, hyenas. It's a brutal perspective on things, but it's certainly not unprecedented historically, or certainly in the modern day. The fact that Francis is this arch-conservative and doesn't live by any of that. I don't need a moment of, the papers saying, oh, look at this hypocrite. But as a political animal, the fact that he becomes this stuffy legacy tailor in the 3rd season, I wanted a moment of his survival being threatened and him becoming that rabid dog again. When there's no purpose beyond, I have to win, and if I lose an inch here, I'm gone. I'm out of the game. The Game of Thrones thing, when they talk about the game, that's the part I love there. That's why even into the last seasons, Varys and Littlefinger were some of my favorite characters, because they were keeping that political intrigue alive, the political thriller element. And that's what I wanted from the end of this. One of the maybe the saving grace of this kind of negative characterization of the end of the third season here, is the realization that as Elizabeth was working in the background, trying to get all this money set up for the prime minister, I mean, she talks to a guy and says, like, I notice prime ministers don't get paid anything, but then when they retire, they've got millions and millions of dollars. How does one arrange that? Like, she's not pointing it out in the way we would as a, dear God, who do they sell their soul to retire with that much money? It's not that. It's her saying, like, how do I get me some of that? And I think that is a relatable feeling. That's some of that rabid dog thing that I just talked about. But I think this might be the thesis of Frances's character, is that never once in their like quiet moments at home when Elizabeth says, hey, I'm trying to figure out stuff for retirement. I don't know, I'm talking to this guy, maybe we can get some money set up here. Never once does Frances give her any attention or validation about that. I mean, he like basically ignores her. He pretends she farted. There's nothing for him. This is the realization I'm coming to. There's nothing for him in that world. There's no game, there's no victory in retirement. And I think this is like the fascinating taste left in my mouth from this series. There's a delicious start here. That word that is used, I mean, every time you look it up, the word delicious will be in there. It's unpleasant. But that sense of momentum, the political thriller thing with that sort of innate human thrill of doing the wrong thing and bad behavior, that is addictive in the first season. And by season 2, our tolerance gets too strong, I think. The story starts to drift. We get to season 3, and even the main character starts to vamp. He's on autopilot. And by the end, everything just shrugs and dies. Like, Frances gets shot by the guy on the roof at the coronation thing at the end of the third series. And there's no soliloquy. He doesn't talk to us one final time. There's like some blood in his mouth and some blood on Elizabeth as she holds him. But he doesn't seem pissed that he's dying. He doesn't seem upset that it's all over. And I'm not saying that's a bad ending, but it's not great. Like, in the same way the ending of the U.S. House of Cards is not great, in the same way the ending of Veep and The West Wing are not great. Like, political shows are kind of my bread and butter. I was raised on West Wing. I've seen it 1 billion times. I love all of the shows I just named. I think as a setting for drama or comedy, they are endlessly compelling. And Ian Richardson is a superb anchor for this particular incarnation. But political shows are strange, because once characters are so lived in for so long, all of these shows I'm talking about went like 7 seasons, except this one, but it moves at such an accelerated plot rate that it kind of covers the same ground, weirdly enough. But with a political show, the ending of your show becomes your closing argument on politics. There's like this unavoidable editorializing, I think, in the end of any of these shows, at least from the ones I've seen. And since finishing this show a couple of days ago, my lingering thought has nothing to do with like the roof diving or the rat poison, even though I enjoyed those things, and I would recommend you go watch the first season immediately and then lower your expectations or just give up. The thing that's sticking with me and kind of disturbing me is that Lady Macbeth stuff with Elizabeth in the last scene. It's those weird little quick conversation scenes of her with heads of industry or international business partners. It's her salivating over the retirement money. And it's not just the greed that bothers me that I kind of gestured at before. It's not just the shamelessness or the freaky law-breaking or international law-breaking. It was the lust. Because I talked about lust being sort of gone from Frances by this point, and that sort of disturbed me in a different way. But I didn't even recognize it while I was watching the show. It's not till like yesterday when I did my notes for this. That lust she had for the retirement money, it was so unbridled, but it was also familiar. Maybe it's not a coincidence that Elizabeth didn't get her own plot. She didn't become this active character until Frances effectively abdicated the throne. He's still the prime minister, the longest-running prime minister in British history, but she's the closest to him. She's the only character who sustains all 3 seasons except Frances. She's the only one in all of those seasons with him. And in that moment where she's like arranging that money, it's not just greed. It's that same familiar greedy, or not greedy, but what was the word? Gleeful. That same gleeful, familiar demon that possessed Frances in season 1. And I think those shots of Elizabeth are us seeing that malice in a new host, with its teeth bared and hungry. It's very disturbing after the fact, and it maybe is a consolation prize that it gets a Shakespeare moment like that, where you can twist the knife in my brain 3 days after I watched the show. It was a really compelling piece of media. 90s TV is a really rare time. I think 6 Feet Under is probably the best thing I've ever seen. Oh no, it's definitely the best thing I've ever seen. But there are certainly quirks and tropes and standards that are very different than they are now. The way drama is paced, what's allowed, almost the... there's not this counterculture sense where everything's trying to be the most independent and free and blah, 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 blah. It's a really interesting time, and I would definitely recommend the first House of Cards. It's 4 episodes it's on Amazon Prime right now. The other 2 are strange, but I want to end on a note that is slightly off to me. So I was looking up a bunch of stuff about the shows just so I could, be more informed going into this. I did the IMDb trivia, I read about the actors, read about their careers, found the thing about Ian Richardson's ashes. But the strangest and maybe most telling part is the book. So I was going to read the book, but I don't know, maybe I still will and come back to this. But the original book ended with Matty confronting Francis on the top of that building about all the people he killed and all the bad things he's done. And in the end of the book, he jumps off the building. He kills himself. So he dies, and she's vindicated. Like, the toppling of the House of Cards, that resolve, I just spent half an hour on how disappointing the ending of the show was. The true ending, the true toppling of the House of Cards from the source material was Francis, it was a self-inflicted wound. It was him inflicting that justice on himself, which I think is fascinating. And maybe the more revealing thing, I guess, about if the statement of the show is about this cynicism and cruelty. After the first season of the show was really successful in this 4-episode miniseries, the writer of the book went back and just changed the ending and kept writing books. He changed it. He got rid of the only resolution that any version of this show will ever get. We've now botched the ending in the UK show, the book that it was based on, and the US ending. So the only canon ending I can possibly believe in for House of Cards is almost incompatible with Francis's character. The idea that he would feel suddenly and so earnestly bad about himself that in the second he's about to become prime minister and achieve the goal he's been fighting for 60 years, he instead accepts that he's a bad person and offs himself. I think that is fascinating, and I'm not saying that couldn't work on screen. I mean, if anyone could pull that off, Ian Richardson could absolutely pull that off in a TV show, and I would have loved to see them record that as an alternate ending for I guess they didn't have DVDs back then, but I really wish we could have seen that, because of course the show just changed it because they wanted to do other seasons. But man, I love that ending, and it's somehow so fitting that it lives in this half-canonical realm of fiction. I don't know, I thought that was a fun button on my experience with this show. But yeah, thank you for taking this weird little detour with me. You and I are going to have some episodes together this October. Maggie and I are really trying to put the work in and keep ahead on the Tolkien episodes. So she's still going to be in all of those, of course, but it's just going to be me for these second breakfast for this week. She might pop in a little bit. I might have Tristan back on, who was in that Malignant episode covering the new James Wan movie. But yeah, this was fun. I always expect these things to be 15 minutes, and they're an hour. So thank you for spending this time with me. House of Cards, fascinating adaptation. amazing performances, great commentary, chock full of Shakespeare stuff. If you're looking for that, yeah. Have a great week, and I enjoyed this little chat we had. If you have any thoughts, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram at secondbreakfastpod. Reach out. We'll respond if it's not, dumb, like any feedback I would send into a podcast. But you're smarter than I am, so yeah, we'll see you Friday for more Tolkien.